Hi, I'm Megan Clark, and I'm in Business Development with Celligence. I'm here to welcome you to our webinar entitled Building a Flexible and Future-Proof IDMP, Data and Process Management Strategy, Part 1. I'm going to start telling you a little bit about our organization and introduce you to our speaker. Celligence was founded in 2017 by executives from the industry who recognized all the challenges that the regulatory affairs teams are faced with today. Our leaders recognized a way to leverage automation and technology to improve compliance for our customers. We're headquartered in Chicago with offices also in London and Bangalore, India. There are three things that we aim to provide for our customers. We aim to improve compliance, increase efficiency and productivity, and reduce costs. A few of our clients are listed here to the right. These are a few of the largest pharmaceutical and medical device organizations that we serve, but we also service many smaller and mid-sized organizations and really value those partnerships. So here we show our global presence, which helps us enable our customers to navigate this complex regulatory landscape that we're in today. This global presence allows us to reduce cost and provide region-specific support to our customers, which is really helpful when you're trying to gain market access into new areas. Also allows us to understand the nuances in each country with their own regulatory rules and compliance strategy. Celligence can provide solutions for the duration of your product lifecycle, so all the way from product development to post-market surveillance. The first pillar is our regulatory consulting. So this is topical. It could be about UDI labeling, or it could be about IDMP or EXVMPD. We also offer audit services in like pharmacovigilance, for example. And we also offer regulatory intelligence consulting and just some general strategic advisory consulting as well. The next three pillars are related to our submissions and regulatory offerings for pharmaceutical organizations. And the full list is listed here, but we'll get into IDMP in just a few minutes. The last pillar is more related to our medical device side, where we offer EU MDR gap assessments and various other medical writing and report writing services. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Wim Cypers. He worked for Eris Global previously, where he defined the company's product and platform strategy. Until 2021, Wim was a member of the EMA IDMP task force. And so today he will share his knowledge and experience with us around IDMP. So Wim, please take it from here.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction, and look forward to a good presentation, and thank you all for joining on this element around IDMP. Before I get started on the actual topics around data management and everything, I want to just drive to you about what are some of the drivers that you are facing today, or at least when I talked about the industry, what have I seen are some of the drivers that are happening. Of course, there is a lot of digital business transformations that are happening, which are essentially focused on the drive towards structured data. I'll come back to that in a second. People are asked to be more efficient, more compliant, that you need to be. There is an increase for data quality, accuracy, reduced administrative burdens are actually being faced. So all of these things are actually heading your way. Yeah. At the same time, we're also talking about things like compliance. We're talking a lot about compliance, and specifically within the context of IDMP, there's of course a lot more that you need to comply with. But the last few years, you've probably focused around XEVMPD. Since 2012, XEVMPD has been a mandate to actually submit product information. Yeah? Since then, we've actually seen at least the EMA move into IDMP and sport. Yeah? Now, what is that? IDMP, to come back in a second what it actually is if you're not familiar with it. But of course, there is a mandate to submit your product information. That mandate already existed with XEVMPD, and with the new ISO-IDMP standard, well, new, it's already there for 10 years, but they are now implementing the new IDMP standards. Yeah? This has been going on for a while, and actually the latest information, which not a scroll, we'll talk about that in the second session a little bit. So next week's session, we'll focus a little bit about the process and how ISO-IDMP is actually implemented into what is called the DADI project, or the EAF program also. Yeah. Now, the first few elements are primarily related to product information in regulatory, submitting your product information. But of course, one of the elements also talks about E2B-R3. So we're talking about submitting your product data, your IDMP data, yeah, in an IDMP format, but this is also going to be very relevant, not just for regulatory. It's not just a matter of sending compliant information across and be done with it. You will also have to find ways to start using that data, yeah, the same way that the authorities do. And E2B-R3 essentially is an example of that. This is on the safety side, submitting of adverse events reports that you can do there, yeah. But that is already made reference to elements like IDMP identifiers. Yeah? Now, timelines for that are still fluid a little bit, but this is something that I expect that to happen somewhere next year, the year after. So this is actually something which is not far away. Yeah? So we're also talking about using IDMP data, and this is actually in the third session in 2 weeks from now. We'll be talking about how, so looking at some use cases around how you can actually use that IDMP data that you submit. Yeah. So we'll be focusing on that a little bit also. Yeah. But key summary here is that there is a digital business transformation happening. It has different shapes and forms, and somehow, as an organization, you will have to deal with this. Right? And again, not just deal from a compliance perspective, but also specifically also from a internal efficiency gains that you can actually make. Yeah? Now, there's a lot of things coming your way, right? And then again, how can you make sense of those? There's a lot of acronyms coming the way: IDMP, DADI, EAF, fire messages, XEVMPD is going to be there. There's a lot of acronyms. SPORE, yeah, is there, yeah. Which talks about substances, product organization, referentials, which is the name of the project within the EMA. But also, a lot of the times when we're talking about IDMP, especially in Europe, it's being looked at as a European initiative, and it actually isn't. Yeah? I think it's also important to be aware that also the FDA is working on this with respect to their SPL, but also in other countries. I'm not going to go through all of the details with respect to this. Yeah. But again, a lot of companies are looking at this, at implementing IDMP. So it's not just a matter of being compliant in Europe. Yeah, it actually is also something that you will need to do across the board. Yeah, and again, that's purely from a compliance perspective. But hopefully, at the end of this session, or at the end of this series, you will also see that IDMP and implementing an IDMP program is not just about compliance. It's also about making business processes more efficient. Yeah. But again, there is a lot of demand. Yeah. Now, the question that I typically get is, okay, but why are we doing this? Right? What is the benefit of this? If it's more than compliance, yeah, where do we need to look at? And I always like to present this from a perspective of, this is an old slide, yeah, that was presented by the EMA at some point in time. I can't even remember the exact date anymore about when it was presented, but it shows you very clearly on how the EMA thinks about IDMP implementation. Yeah, it talks about, it's not just about regulatory, it's not just about one element within that cycle. It actually is a process, or it's a standard which is being implemented across the product life cycle. Yeah? And if you're aware, and if you read up on certain things, or if you've seen in different webinars, they actually talk about looking at this from different perspectives. It goes from clinical all the way to marketed products, all the way to the end of the life cycle. And what the EMA specifically is also doing, and they've published certain documents on that, they are integrating their internal systems. Why? Because they actually want to get a view of an end-to-end process. How is your product evolving? How is your product moving along across the life cycle? Yeah. And of course, the main benefit of that is patient safety, or the main driver for that for an authority is patient safety. Yeah. And benefits, of course, are also important, but it's about how can we make sure that we understand the product end to end from the beginning to the end, and have a common standard that brings all of those domains together, that brings clinical together with regulatory, together with safety, and even also manufacturing in the end. Yeah. So if you look at it from that perspective, this is, if I hadn't told you that this was an EMA slide, you probably would also have been able to look at it as saying, well, this could be an internal slide also. Yeah? So if you look at what the authorities are doing, there is no reason why, as an organization, as a life sciences organization, you could also look at IDMP as a way to integrate your different systems and make your business processes more efficient, to make your data more efficient. Yeah. So this is a general introduction about what it is and how it actually works. Yeah? But if you now look at it today, we're primarily talking about data. Right? Of course, the first thing is about what do we want to do? And in those 3 sessions, in the 3 weeks, this week and the next 2 weeks, the first thing that we'll be talking about is how do you move from documents to data? How do you store the data? Where do you get the data? What are some ideas? What are some challenges that we've seen in the industry with respect to collecting the data? Because it's one thing, a lot of companies have moved, are storing their documents in data, or storing their information in documents. Yeah, and they are now, because of this data transformation, they're now asked to bring it into structured data. So we'll be looking about how can you get there, yeah, and how can you build a structure, or how can you build something that is efficient, not just from a compliance point of view, but also from a perspective of internal benefits for your organization. The next 2 sessions, next week and the week after, we'll have a look at process. How can you get there? Also compliance and beyond compliance, with some exact use cases on what you can do. But as I said, today we'll be focusing on the data. Yeah? How do you get your data into it? Yeah? Where do you, and the first question that typically comes up is, okay, but where will I store that data? Yeah? Some companies might already have a solution in place and might have a master data management solution in place. So where that could function as a basis, but if you don't have, yeah, I think you can ask a few questions to start off with, yeah. Or what are some of the requirements? What have I seen when we're looking at these projects? What have I seen as some elements is, of course, it needs to be compliant, yeah. It needs to integrate, yeah. There has to be data exchange between different solutions, between different elements, yeah. Most companies are also looking at a phased implementation, and it can grow, which is actually also important to mention, that the solution that you would be looking for, or the solution that you implement, make sure that it's expandable, right? Guidelines are changing, regulations are changing, there are new regulations coming in. So if you build a solution around a single regulation or a single problem, a business problem, it will actually be very limiting, yeah? Of course, you want to leverage as much as you can on existing data, right? Companies look at it and say, and when I mention here existing data, it also includes documents. Yeah? You don't want to have to rekey everything in or have to do anything. So the solutions that companies are looking for in this particular point are, how can I actually get that data in a more efficient way? Yeah. They also realized from the very beginning that there is a lot of differences in terminology being used, yeah, that has to be reconciled. That there are also different needs for different domains. Yeah? Every domain has its own requirements, has its own set of data, but it also has its own requirements. If you talk about what regulatory needs, what safety needs, is very much different from what clinical needs, for instance. Yeah? And of course, also you want to leverage on data sources. So when you're actually talking about data, yeah, and where you collect that data, it's very clear that it'll come from multiple places, right? Internal, external, different requirements are there, either from a regulatory side or from an internal business perspective. There is a lot of requirements that your solution will have to meet, yeah, when it comes to data. Yeah. Now, jumping directly into solution, yeah. What I've seen is that I've been involved in several projects, and the most successful projects that I've seen are actually projects that focus on a central repository to store, in first instance, the IDMP product data and the related data, but also, and because I said it's extendable, yeah, we could actually see that some companies have looked at that in a larger MDM solution, master data management solution. Yeah. So, but essentially we're looking at, the summary is that the best solutions that I've seen are a separate central repository. Yeah. I'll show you in a minute also a second scenario that also has success in certain areas, yeah, which actually starts from a regulatory process. Yeah. But what is it? Why an MDM? Well, it's of course there are some negatives to it also. There's a larger investment this is needing. Most companies have to build a new repository around this. So it does require the data collection programs need to be set up, integrations have to be built and so on. So from a first glance, yeah, a central repository, building an MDM solution or even a central repository for your data management or your IDMP data management seems to be very comprehensive, and it takes a lot of time to build it up and money. And it's true. I mean, you can't deny that this is a larger investment. But at the same time, building an MDM and building a central repository gives you a lot of benefits, and especially if you look at it from a long-term perspective, if you want to build something which is future-proof, yeah, you really have to think about, okay, how do we build this? How do we build it in a sense that it's expandable? Yeah, as I already mentioned, today we have SPOR, we have the DADI project going on, but tomorrow the FDA comes in. You might have different internal requirements. Yeah. So again, you want to have it's an expandable solution. Yeah. Yeah. It's not influenced by changes in regulations. Yeah. What I mean with that is if tomorrow XEVMPD changes, you don't have to change your whole strategy. Yeah, you might have to pick up some parts of your central repository. You might have to fine-tune that, tweak it, but it doesn't address your source data. It doesn't impact your regulatory, the regulatory data, for example, your regulatory system is not necessarily impacted by that particular change. Yeah. There is also your business processes. It might not be obvious from this particular slide, but hopefully when we go through the presentations and the set, you will actually see that by approaching it as a central repository, you don't necessarily have to make changes into your source information, yeah, and also in your source processes, yeah. So essentially, this is what I see is, in personally also what I've seen is the most sensible solution, the most flexible solution. It costs a little bit more, yeah, in both time and money probably, but long-term, future-proof, and IDMP is not going to go away, yeah. It actually is a better solution to start thinking about a central repository. Now, as I also mentioned, there are other approaches also, right? And again, I don't want to minimize those. Another solution that I have actually also seen working is if you build based on the regulatory system, instead of putting a separate central repository in place, what companies have said, okay, well, IDMP is actually 80–90% comes from the regulatory system. And you're right, especially if you look at SPOR iteration 1, yeah, majority of the data will come from your regulatory. You should probably already have that in your regulatory RIM system. Yeah, some companies already extract XEVMPD from that. Yeah, and it would only be logical to then think about, well, I can also think my IDMP, my DADI data can also be exported from that. Yeah. And as I said, I don't want to minimize this. It is also lesser expensive but I personally think it is lesser future-proof. Yeah? And what I mean with that being lesser future-proof is the fact that based on your regulatory, in the same way, yeah, that you had all these arrows on the previous slide going from the central repository to your guidelines and to your internal, you now put a lot of strain on your regulatory system. Yeah? Especially if you start looking at expansions, yeah, above and beyond compliance, yeah, when you're actually starting to say, look, regulatory, or if safety starts asking regulatory to say, look, I need the IDMP data, please give it to me. Or if clinical starts saying, look, I want to start exchanging data, you actually put a lot of strain on your regulatory systems, yeah, instead of having a central repository. Yeah. So from that sense, it's a viable solution, but it's lesser expensive, but on the other hand, it does put a lot of strain. So from a future perspective, yeah, future-proof, I think it'll catch up with respect to your investments, and it will put a lot of additional efforts with respect to integrations and so on. Yeah. If you do think about going that solution, though, one thing that I would advise you is really to make sure that before you make a decision, and if you say, well, we still want to do this and we don't really want to go onto a different track, yeah, make sure that your regulatory, your process, and your data is cleanly separated within your RIM system. As I said, at the first glance, it looks interesting, it looks lesser expensive, it looks better, yeah, but it isn't, in my opinion, at least. Yeah. The benefits, as I said, can your regulatory solution work? As I said, yeah, data in RIMS mostly happens to XEVMPD, mentioned that before. At the first glance, especially now with iteration 1, it'll map very clearly. Yeah. The risk of modifications are there. Yeah. So in the RIMS solutions, due to changing regulatory submission requirements, that's what I mentioned also, is the fact that as soon as something changes in your regulations, you will also have an impact on your RIM system. You will have to upgrade your RIM system, which is not always what you want to happen. Yeah. Also integrations with other systems. Yeah, you put strain onto your RIM solution if you want to integrate with other systems, and if those other systems have different regulatory requirements or have to comply to regulatory requirements. Yeah, it's also not easy to manage terminologies and so on. We'll come back to how consistency within your data plays an important role, how terminology alignment is an important thing, and that can be better managed much better into a central repository, according to me. Yeah. Again, summary here is that it is possible to use a RIM system also for this. I don't want to minimize the value for that either. Yeah, I don't want to look at and say that that is absolutely not a viable solution. But I do want you to think about it. I think it makes sense to critically think about it. Is this a short-term solution, or is this really our long solution that we're actually looking at? So it's very clear that I'm mostly in benefit or mostly in favor of a central repository approach here, right? So let's look at that a little bit more detail. Now, some of the things that I'll be mentioning about data collection, data accuracy, that also plays a role, of course, when you think about a regulatory system. Yeah. But let me approach it from a central repository. Yeah. And then, of course, the first thing that you need to think about is that, okay, but what is the basis for that central repository? We now decided the first question was, where do we store it? We came to a central repository. What structure do we use? Yeah. IDMP, of course, ISO-IDMP is the perfect perfect solution for that. I mean, it's an international standard, well-adopted standard, yeah. Which, by the way, and I'll mention this up front also, doesn't necessarily mean you have to follow it literally, yeah. I also have seen solutions that have just literally copied and pasted the data model from IDMP into your central repository, yeah. That should also not be the idea, in my opinion, to do something like that. But nevertheless, make sure that the concepts are there. Make sure that you build it around an ISO-IDMP compliant framework. Yeah. Now, 2 slides quickly on ISO-IDMP for some that you might not be available for that. I'm not going to go into details. We could spend hours on explaining you how it works. It is an international standard, as I said, an ISO standard that focuses around product information. And when I talk about product information, yeah, we're talking about elements related to anything to do with a product. We're talking about substances, we're talking about pharmaceutical products, which is essentially just your tablet, for instance, your 500 milligram tablet. It's how it's packaged, it's how it's registered or approved in specific countries. Yeah. So it also captures not just, it goes all the way down from your substance level, all the way down to your authorization. Yeah, it also captures information about the manufacturing as well as your clinical particulars. So clinical particulars being elements around what do you use it for? So indications, contraindications, and so on. Yeah. So from that sense, we're really talking about product information. Yeah. Now, final thing in that in this introduction, it's essentially, before I move into the data collection piece of this presentation, is about what makes it future-proof. Yeah. I mentioned it already a few times, but I just wanted to emphasize it again. It makes it future-proof because you're building a repository based on a standard. Yeah. This standard will evolve. You will be able to move this around. Yeah. But it is something that is a standard. Yeah. It's not something that you do uniquely. It is something that is done within the industry. Yeah. It's based on specific needs, yeah, where you can extract subsets. You can extract a subset for safety, XEVMPD, SPOR version 1, version 2. Yeah, so it is actually extendable, as I mentioned, or it can be expanded very easily going forward also. Yeah. Also, when regulations change, you can change the regulations without actually having an impact on your other integrations, right? What safety needs, yeah, is there. If SPOR or now goes from one operating model to another, or if DADI in this particular case Yeah, if they move this, you can actually focus on that part and only change that without changing anything else or impacting any other business processes that you might have already built. Yeah. And of course, new business needs can be added much easily, yeah, which also brings me to the point that you actually gradually have to build up this particular program. It's not an all or nothing. Yeah, it is something that you can build very easily. Yeah. So now, first part was around the repository. Where do you store the information? Why does it make sense to have a central product dictionary and move forward with that? Yeah. Now, of course, when you have that structure or that central repository, you have to populate that also. Yeah, I mean, it's not relevant if you don't have the data in it, of course. Yeah. So what are you going to do is that, where are you going to get the data? So in the next few slides, I really want to focus on where can you get the data and what do you need to look out for? You know, what can you get and what do you need to focus on? Yeah. So I think the first thing is that you need to ask the question is, where can you get the data? And I think you'll soon come to a realization that, especially if you look at iteration 1 for the moment for Europe, yeah, you will come to regulatory is probably your main source of information. Yeah. Now you could take it a step back also and even go further, and then I start asking the question about, okay, but where does regulatory get their data? Yeah. So, but that's for now, assume that the data with regulatory that and we'll come back to the golden source of information, but regulatory definitely will have a lot of information. It already is the source for XDV-MPD, most likely. Yeah. And so it's also logical that from an IDMP perspective, you look at that data. Yeah. The second source of information, I mentioned that earlier, what also companies are looking for is to say, look, but great, that's all great, but we have a lot of data that is being requested in documents. Yeah. So when you build a project like this, or when you build a process in place, make sure that the solution that you put in place or the solution that you find in the market also deals with unstructured data in a nice way. Yeah. Because a lot of data is there, and the last thing you want to do is, especially if you're a bigger company, is drill down your thousands of documents and put the data in manually. Yeah. It's not much more secure than, for instance, an NLP process, that it is the errors that are being made in there are as much. Yeah? But make sure that you basically have a solution. Think about solutions that can actually bring documents into the mix and make it into data. Yeah? You will also quickly identify that there are other sources in place. We're saying regulatory for now, but as soon as you start building out your processes and your more advanced beyond compliance aspects, you will see that other sources are also there. Yeah. What those other sources there are, I think, could be anything. Clinical information is there, with study information is there, especially if you're talking about the investigational side of the products. Batch information, so manufacturing information is also there. Yeah. And then, of course, also think about external sources. Yeah. External standards are there, especially if you're familiar with the SPOR. There is the O and the R, yeah, the organizations and referentials in the SPOR initiative. Those talk about manufacturer data, referentials, which are code lists, list pick lists, and so on, are actually managed by the authority. So you can actually leverage on that also. Yeah. So you really need to look at that type of data also and make sure that that type of data can also be brought into your solutions. And then you also have things about MEDRA, for instance, which are other standards. There's so many others. Unicom has a lot of standards also, not having listed all of them here, but you will actually see that over time, you will be able to identify more external sources that are actually also can contribute to your completeness of data, your accuracy of data. Yeah. And then, of course, there is also a technology layer that you have to consider when you build that central repository, because all of that data that you have somehow will have to make it into the central repository. And the last thing you want to do is have to enter it all manually or put manual processes in place that bring the data from one place to another. So we'll also be talking 1-2 slides on technology and what some of the considerations there are. Yeah. But let's first of all now look at data also. Yeah, data. Well, the first thing that you'll need to look at is and I would highly recommend that if you haven't done so yet, is do a data assessment. Yeah, how ready is my data? Yeah, and even I would say even if you have done it before, yeah, it's a bit difficult to say, but what I've also seen is that companies repeat this on a regular basis. They basically just do an assessment to see how things have changed, primarily because in some cases, some of you might have done this data assessment a few years ago. Yeah, if you've done it recently, it might still be accurate. Yeah, but again, regulations have changed in the meantime, also different focuses there. So it never hurts to actually do another data assessment. Yeah, we'll look a little bit at completeness, accuracy, consistency, timeliness of that data, why these things are important when you look at the data. Yeah, and then of course we'll talk about data ownership and data maintenance strategy. Yeah, because this is not just a one-time event. You have to put accountability in place. You have to put processes in place and strategies in place that make sure that whatever you build now will still work 2, 5, 10 years from now. Yeah, because as I said, IDMP, in my opinion, is not going to go away. So let's have a little bit of a look at some of those elements and what some of the points are that we need to consider. The first is the completeness of the data. Yeah, as a basis, you can always start looking at IDMP. Yeah, what the data is there, iteration 1, what fields are there. Probably don't try to do ISO-IDMP at once. You can start focusing on iteration 1, yeah, for that, especially because that's a near compliance issue. But can always keep ISO-IDMP standard in mind. Yeah. Then identify what the primary source is. Where can I get that data? Yeah. And really what I mentioned before already also is think about, okay, regulatory might be a source, but is regulatory really the source of it? Yeah? Or where does regulatory get their data? Yeah. Do I need to go a step back? Yeah. Have they translated the data already from the original source? Yeah. So really some things that you also need to consider with respect to where, what is actually your primary source? Yeah. Or what is your golden source? Yeah. What I think you could also identify some business cases up front, right? What do you want to achieve? Maybe that should have been the first point onto the whole thing is, what do you really want to achieve here? Yeah. And not just short time, but also keep in mind your long-term objectives. Yeah. The map IDMP fields, what are the additional needs that you might have on the business side? What businesses make sense? So really build your 3 to 5 year, if not longer, roadmap for this particular solution and identify, because some of the things you might not be immediately working on might be relevant in how you make certain decisions. Yeah? Of course, high level, you're not going to do a data assessment for all of those, but at least from a process point of view, you should high level already know what exactly is available. Yeah? Identify what data you have, which format it has. Is data collection needed? Is cleaning needed? So when you look at your data, it's where is it? Yeah, what quality is it? Is it complete and so on? And is it there already? Yeah, and in what format is it available? Yeah. So that's really one of the elements that you need to look at. Yeah, completeness. The second thing that you want to look at is, of course, accuracy of data. Yeah, it's not because it's there that it's also accurate. Yeah, I've seen several examples where essentially we've done an assessments where you said, look, all the data is there, but if you really drill down on it, that is not accurate. Yeah. That it's outdated, yeah? That some of the records that were in the system have never been updated for X amount of years or X amount of months. Yeah? It was either based on unreliable data, that on unreliable sources where all documents were shipped to you, nobody looked at the date on the document, it was just put in, it was an old document. So you really need to look at it, and the perspective is not is it there, but is also, is it accurate? Yeah? Is it up to date? Yeah? Also things like, is it available on a global basis? Yeah? A lot of the time what I've also seen, again in the context of future proof, companies have started looking at it from a perspective of, oh, EMA, SPOR, DADI is a European initiative, so let me just look at the European data. Yeah? It is a viable solution, and of course if you have resource constraints you might be looking at the data, but be aware that if you only look at the European data now, that tomorrow you might be doing the exact same exercise for the rest of the world data. Yeah. So I always feel that, look, if you're cleaning up your data anyway, you might as well clean up it for the rest of the world. Even if Europe only requires European data, yeah, keep in mind that the data that you're looking at is not just for XEVMPD or for spore, yeah, but you also want to gain advantages within your organization. Yeah. So from that sense, limiting this to only European data might actually set you back in certain areas also. Yeah. Accuracy of data also has a time element to it. Maybe another example is essentially what I've also seen is that companies over time change their processes, they change how they work with certain elements, yeah, or with certain data elements, to be more specific, how they populate them. So it could actually be, if you look at the status today, yeah, that everything it seems to be okay. But if you look at it from a horizontal perspective, so really more from a historical perspective, that all your data might actually not be as clean as you want it to be. Yeah. So really accuracy of data, very important. Yeah. So you look, first of all, is it there? But is it accurate? Yeah. Is it correct what I have there, or do I just accept it? Certain, also look at it, but that leads into the second session about process-wise, is looking at, okay, what information or what processes are in place, for instance, to actually make sure that accuracy is there. Consistency is also an important thing, and that's probably, when I do my assessments, this is really something that is really one of the more challenging ones, or the most interesting ones to talk about. It's really, if you talk to different departments, if you talk to everybody uses the same, supposedly the same terminology, uses internal terminology, but they all talk the same, different language. Yeah, the examples here are clear. Salt is sodium chloride, it's all the same. Yeah, but it is consistent within that department. But you have to start looking about consistency cross departments here also. Yeah. The elements like RMS, OMS, ISO standards can actually help with that. Yeah, and RMS, OMS, there are standards that are there. Yeah, and I think you have to define a strategy for harmonizations. Yeah, which doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to start talking the same language. I'll come back to that in a minute also. Yeah, and you can change it over time, but also don't try to change everything at once, right? I mean, it's very difficult to make changes, and especially people that I've talked about in certain languages. But you have to be aware that this is probably one of the main challenges when it comes to implementing IDMP is bringing different data sources into it. It's essentially data consistency and how people talk and how people translate things. Yeah. So we'll actually look at that in a second also with a very concrete timeline. Yeah. Timelines, yeah, another consideration now when you look at data, because yeah, you can look at the data, it can be accurate, it can be correct, you might have all the translations in place, but you also have to think about it, and this is indeed purely partly towards compliance, is the data timely? Yeah, because you also know, if you're talking about compliance, you will have to submit your XEVMPD and put it on your DADI and your FHIR messages in the future. You will also have to submit them in a timely manner. Yeah, they'll have to be submitted, and as soon as you get the approval, within X amount of days, you will have to submit that data to the authorities. So if you look at your golden sources, the question also is that, are they entering the information timely? Yeah, will I get the information timely from my golden source? Yeah, or do I have to make a change in that particular point? It's also something which is overlooked a lot of times, and then you at last minute when you go in production, you might have to start chasing them up continuously. So make sure that you have that under control, and probably also make very clear agreements with the source system by saying, look, yes, this is the reason why it is, and basically you have to do this for this and this reason. Yeah, which, by the way, but that's maybe another argument that I will tell you a bit later also, is the fact that when you're talking about your source and you say, okay, I need your data accurate, I need your data timely, I need this. Yeah, you also have to think about what is also talking in the senses of not just about what you need to be compliant, what the organization needs to be compliant, but also think about IDMP in the sense of what it could mean for them. Yeah, if you go to them and say, look, you have to provide me all of this data accurately, correct, in a timely manner. Yeah, and it gives them more work. Yeah, you will also have to give them, of course, benefits for them. But that's, as I said, as a side note to really think about it from a perspective, if you want to make this future-proof, make sure that you give the benefits to whoever needs to supply your information there. And I can assure you, most companies that have looked into this have come to very concrete examples of how it could benefit sources also, because they can get information that they might not have information today. Yeah, they might also have information automatically sent to them rather than them having to manually key it in. Yeah, but as I said, that was just a side note from that perspective. Yeah, once you've identified all your data, you made it clean. Of course, you also have to make data ownership and, as I said, data management strategies also have to be put in place. Yeah? It's not just about the one-time transfer. Yeah? You have to identify who's responsible for the data. You have to make sure that the right process is in place to assure the quality. Over time, you have to put your consistency checks, your quality checks in place. Quality assurance steps have to be put in place. A lot of those things are, of course, all mostly around processes that you have to put in place. But technology can also help with that a lot of the times, right? Where you can actually say this, how you transfer the data, how you do automated quality checks. All of that can also be very important within your process of data ownership and accountability. So really, when you're going to build a future-proof IDMP solution, data, ownership, and maintenance are three very key words, I would say, within your whole solution here, or within your whole element that you mentioned. Yeah. Now, one thing I haven't talked about yet, which I want to address now, is technology. Yeah. Of course, I mentioned also is that yes, you have to identify your data. Yeah. But when it comes to when you have your central repository, you have all the data, you have the process in place to keep it up to date. Yeah, and now you want to start exchanging data. Yeah, as I said, it shouldn't be one directional. Yeah, of course, you have to bring the source data in. It has to be done in an efficient way. It has to be done in a way that reduces the manual effort as much as possible, or even completely takes it away from that matter. So technology is a very important aspect in this particular element also. Yeah. And when you think about technology, yeah, the first thing that you need to think about is elements like how do I get the data in? This is purely technology. This is pure technical, where you're talking about what data sources do I have and what do I actually need to bring that data into my central repository. And first step is, of course, bringing it into your central repository. Second step will also be how can I take data out of my central repository? Yeah. So all of that data also has to be considered. And the first layer is pure technical. Yeah. Does the solution, the technical solution that I have in place, yeah, does that support multiple ways of communication? Yeah. Does it support web services? Does it support APIs? Yeah. Does it, for documents specifically, does it have OCR and NLP capabilities? Right. Does it have gateway capabilities for XCV-MPD, for instance? Right. And even for if you have very old systems in place, you might still want to consider a very basic point-to-point solution. Yeah? So it might not necessarily be an API, but you might still leverage on older technologies. Think about this when you select your technology framework, your technology platform, before you actually start deciding. Yeah? Because building onto that platform might be easier, might be difficult, but make sure, again, towards that vision of future-proof, make sure that you actually know what you're actually getting into. Yeah. Of course, there is also data transformations that need to happen. Yeah. Field mappings have to be done. This is actually an internal layer where there's some user interactions that will need to happen. Fields will have to be mapped. Data will have to be mapped. Schedulers will have to be defined on when is data transferred, at what point in time, to who. So what are some of the triggers? Data review workflows might happen onto that central repository. Data consistency checks through rule builders. So there are certain functionality that you also have to think about it, right? So the central repository is not just a matter of a repository with a technical layer around it. It also has to have a functional layer around it. Yeah. And just to give you one example about the data mappings, for instance, this is really where I come back to my example of terminology alignments and everything, which is very much, I've primarily always seen this having to be addressed by technology, is that if you try to have everybody talk the same language, it's not going to happen. Yeah, and this is something you can be ambitious. You can say, from now on, everybody talks about salt, everybody talks about it, but it can be happen a few times, but over time it goes away. Yeah, and people fall back into their own old habits. Yeah, so technology here can help very, very strongly with respect to these kind of translations. Just to give you one example, there's so many other examples that I could put onto this slide, but really synonyms, translations are there. I now talked about even people talking in English in 3 places, but at some point in time, you will also have to think about different languages. Yeah? And really technology here can help you very, very strongly with a mapping tool between even external standards like OMS, RMS. So I think that's really one area where technology can help very, very closely. Yeah. So looking at the time, I think we've reached almost the end of this. So what is next here? What is next? I want to just conclude here by saying, yeah, most companies are making progress. So when I really look at where we are in the market today, companies are making progress. Yeah, but it always makes sense to re-evaluate your strategy. Yeah, companies like Celligence, for instance, could help you with it, and really also looking at external help is very important. I think it's not mentioned on the slide directly, but what you also see is, yeah, you have your inside world, your internal world, you know your own business. But what other companies like Celligence could bring to the market, for instance, is the fact that they have experience from multiple sources, multiple companies, where they have seen what works, what doesn't work, what works well. So really that could also be brought into it. So re-evaluation of your mappings, but also bringing on the internal or the external experiences from other companies into your mix, I think would be very important here also. Yeah. Also putting in a few questions here that you could ask yourself to see, okay, do we need a reorganization of the of it? Probably just to pick one. If you basically, with the new EMA changes, with 2 words from a more fire message, an XEVMPD-like IDMP program to a DADI approach now, if you've now made a statement that says, look, I have to throw everything away, yeah, that I've done in the past, probably you might want to look at re-evaluating your strategy. But there are different things that you could look at to see whether your current IDMP strategy is working or whether it needs some fine-tuning here also. Yeah. So with that said, I hope it was somewhat relevant, that you got some ideas about what it could mean for your program if you are running one, or what you could do if you are actually starting to run a program. Yeah. But I see we have some time left, so maybe we'll open it up for some questions here and see if I can't answer the question online here. I will definitely also take the time after the session to answer any questions that have been raised.
Thank you, Wim. That was incredibly informative. I'm looking forward to parts 2 and 3 in the series. And just before we continue into the Q&A, I would like to remind attendees today that if you haven't already done so, you can register on our website, celligence.com, for parts 2 and 3 of the series to get the full experience of this IDMP topic. So Wim, we have a few questions lined up. If you could join us on screen again to answer them, please.
Sure, should be there.
What we'll do then is I will ask the questions, Wim, and if you can answer them, and then just let me know in the chat when you're done. So
Sure.
Question 1, should I check all products, or can I get by with a sample size to check the aspects you mentioned in the presentation, quality, accuracy, etc.?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, thanks for letting me know you could hear me, because it would have been interesting to just been talking for 50 minutes and nobody's hearing me. But no, first of all, thanks for the question. I think it's a fair question to ask, and I think the answer is, of course, depends. Yeah, as a lot of answers are in regulatory, but yeah, I think there are a few considerations that you can look at. I mean, it's not realistic to start looking at all of your products, all of your data. So I think the first thing is really to look at what is my portfolio. And I really would suggest that you take some products and look at them end to end. Yeah? So all the fields, but identify which products you think. Take a simple one, take a complexer one. If you have recombination or reconstituted products, combination products, make sure that you select a certain set of products to do. Yeah, but again, you can't do everything, but make sure that the set of products that you select is a real representation of your portfolio. Yeah. Having said that, that's on the product side. On the other side, I would also suggest that you have a look at it from a perspective of data elements. There are certain data elements that are essentially worth checking, yeah, across the board. Yeah. So you might actually take extracts of your data and look at those. For instance, if you know that the usage of a field has changed over time, take an extract of that field and look at that particular information 100%. Yeah. So I think that could be a fairly good approach also. You can also, certain other things like important data, it goes a little bit to the previous thing about key data elements, but there is also important data like, for instance, your referentials, your organizations, yeah, especially things that come from RMS and OMS in the SPORE project. I would say make sure that you do a complete analysis of those. Yes, check, are you compliant? Is that fully available against those particular standards? Yeah. So essentially the answer in short is essentially it depends, as I said at the beginning, but there are certain rules that I mentioned. Yeah. And definitely if you're afraid of checking all the fields or all the contents of a field, I think Excel, and I've personally been using VLOOKUPs very, very frequently. If I compare with RMS and OMS, you could also do consistency checks. So also don't be afraid to take your data out of the system in Excel and compare these things, especially if you start looking at data elements across the board also. So I hope that answers. If you have any follow-up, feel free to answer it in the chat also. Yeah. So, oh, I'm not sure whether you can hear me in the meantime, but
yes. Sorry, I'm having to join by mobile as well.
Okay. Yeah, there's a little bit of an echo now, but I see I think there's about 2 or 3 other questions, I believe, right? Oh no, sorry, 2, I think.
So can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Great. So second question, we've got about 5 minutes left. Are there special considerations for complex products like reconstituted of combination products?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit of an extension to the first question around the product types. As I said, make sure that if you have those products, make sure that you select those products also in evaluation. And there's definitely considerations that you need to do. A lot of those things also depend on how your system is built, on how your RIM system or how your data sources are actually built. Yeah, so that's one consideration. You have to think about those. But also from a regulatory perspective, if you look at IDMP itself, yeah, the way simple products are handled is completely different, or not completely different, but is different, for instance, than how, as you met, for instance, reconstituted or combination products are actually considered. Yeah. So when you're thinking about a reconstituted product, for instance, I mean, the most important thing, for instance, is the difference between what you manufacture and how it is reconstituted. That's a concept that didn't exist in XEVMPD, for instance, so that might also be a good consideration for those type of products. XEVMPD didn't really make that distinction. Yeah, so also make sure that it's not because you have XEVMPD that you essentially you're IDMP compliant. You might not have a problem with iteration 1 for SPORE in the end, but essentially your if you want to be IDMP compliant towards the future, and if you really want to make the system future proof, you have to look at those kind of things. Yeah. So reconstituted, for instance, is the difference between manufactured item and your reconstituted composition, for instance. Yeah. Same thing for combination products. Combination products compared to reconstituted, I feel, are a bit simpler in my definition. But it all is in the eye of the beholder, of course. But from that sense, I would say, but of course, the concept of devices and combining them with 2 pharmaceutical products that you put in a box as a combination, or a combination of a pharmaceutical product with a device, pre-filled syringes, all of those things are, as you rightly pointed out, are complex products that have their own way of managing an IDMP. And if we do an assessment, we have to be aware of those kind of things so that you can look at data differently also. Yeah. I see there's one more question, so I'll cut it short here, and I see we'll take the last question in the last 2 minutes. So
yeah, that's fine. So what about device products? Do they also fall under this regulation?
yeah, no, this is I just mentioned devices in the previous answer, so that's probably an interesting question on that. If you're looking at IDMP, I think you have to make a distinction between a device which is a pure device and a device which is actually in combination with a pharmaceutical product or is packaged together with your pharmaceutical product. Yeah? To answer the question directly, devices as such, if you look at a device as a device, they do not fall under the IDMP definitions. They are looked at, there are other regulations around UDI, yeah, that actually has a very similar concept to IDMP, but is actually intended for devices. Yeah. Having said that, again, if you look at a device completely as a standalone, you have to look really at UDI. Yeah, and this is really, it is also a regulation, by the way. It is also, if you have devices and you haven't looked into that, definitely do into that, because this is already in production. Yeah. Of course, a device within the context of pharmaceutical product, like I mentioned just now about combination products, where you have a pharmaceutical and a device, a pre-filled syringe, then of course it is important. But the whole UDI is not embedded in IDMP in that case. So what IDMP does in that area is really make a reference to UDI in that particular concept. Yeah. So I think that link between the different standards is also being taken care and is also taken in consideration, and devices is a perfect example of that. Yeah.